Hi, I'm Stewart Spinks and welcome to episode 341 of my podcast, Beekeeping Short and Sweet. It's on your marks, get set and go. We've carried out our first brief but important inspections along with some spring cleaning, and as usual, it's a mixed bag. Spring has arrived and we're starting our beekeeping season. Listen in to find out how I got on. Beekeeping Short and Sweet, a beekeeping podcast for the inquisitive beekeeper with a short attention span. A beekeeper, in fact, just like me. Before we get into today's beekeeping conversation, and in the absence of anyone else supporting my podcast with an advert or two, here's my little self-promotion again. For all of you who haven't yet signed up to my Patreon page, I, together with Steph, have been creating beekeeping content for many years now, and if you're looking for some straightforward, down-to-earth tips and techniques, help and advice, then do take a look at my Patreon page. We have over 1,600 individual beekeeping posts, videos and podcasts filled with useful and timely help and advice. My approach is pragmatic and calm, sometimes entertaining, but always with help and support for beekeepers at the heart of what I do. I keep my videos short and concise wherever possible, no waffle, no flannel, just honest beekeeping advice from years of keeping bees. Take a look and join me for the new 2025 beekeeping season. It'll cost you less than a jar of honey, and you never know, there may be something there that will help you improve your beekeeping. Head over to Google and search for Patreon and the Norfolk Honey Company. Hi everyone. Well, here we go. It really does feel like we're in for a fast start with the weather already warming up nicely, and next week looking incredibly warm for the time of year. But before I launch into my weather report and we all get carried away with inspections and all sorts of other manipulations, let's not forget that it is still very early in the season and things can change very quickly. I am inclined to believe the current forecast for the next week, however. Just looking at it here online, the current warm weekend of around 16 degrees Celsius, that's around 61 degrees Fahrenheit, by the way, is set to continue and actually get warmer still, with Thursday next week looking likely to hit 18 degrees Celsius, possibly higher. That's around 64 degrees Fahrenheit. It's crazy, really. Climate change, global warming, maybe just a blip, who knows? The one thing we can say is that those increased temperatures are going to give our bees a welcome change in the weather. And here in East Anglia, here in the east of England, with it being dry and sunny, it does look like they will have a very busy week indeed. Looking further ahead, it still appears to be sunny and warm, so who knows where we're heading this spring. Of course, as I've already said, it could all change in a blink, so a cautious, responsive view is required, ready to adapt when we need to. It does mean that fewer bees will be required to manage the brood nest thermostat, and those excess are then free to get out and forage. Nighttime temperatures are still quite low though, so there will be a need for colonies to manage that, but as soon as a couple of frames of brood emerge, that population of adults will skyrocket and progress into the new season will accelerate for them. We currently have 4 apiary locations that we're using, and many of you will be familiar with our fishing lakes apiaries. Here, we're very lucky to have a vast quantity of willow trees, particularly a type called goat willow. They are by far the dominant species here, certainly the dominant tree species, and right now they're just getting into their flowering period. They have separate male and female plants, the male trees producing those bright yellow bushy catkins loaded with pollen, while the female plants have a bright green flower producing nectar. Combine the two and you get reproduction by the formation of seeds and a reward of proteins and carbs for our honeybees at a much needed time of the year. With brood nests expanding, there are many more larvae that need feeding, and this fresh food source is very welcome by the bees and, of course, by us beekeepers. For me, it signals a time of year when a lot of change takes place and is like somebody sounding the klaxon at the start of a marathon race. For many of us, it feels like a bit of a frenzied start, but soon settles into that long-distance run, the finishing line seemingly such a long way off, but we all know the season's end will arrive soon enough. So, how do I approach my spring start? Well, it's fairly straightforward, and I suspect very similar to other beekeepers the world over. We've spent the last couple of months watching our hives, checking for signs of life. The flying bees at the entrance, popping out for water or on toilet flights, the hefting and the sneaky looks under the roof to hopefully see adult workers moving around through either clear coverboards or through the feed holes in the crown board, topping up fondant if I felt the need, although this hasn't really been necessary, and I do think, certainly here in the UK, beekeepers have taken to adding fondant almost as a matter of course, without any assessment as to whether their colonies need that extra food or not. This, I imagine, will create challenges for some of these beekeepers, as overwintered colonies, now expanding, will find they have an excess of food stores and not much room for a growing brood nest, ultimately causing congestion and a certain contributor to early spring swarming. Just be mindful of how much space your colony has as the flush of spring nectar and pollen comes into your hive, and, if necessary, remove a couple of outside frames that are solid with food and replace them, if possible, with empty frames of drawn comb positioned next to the brood area. Now here is where experience really helps, and is really only something you get to learn over time. It requires taking all of the information a hive is giving you and combining that with the time of year, what's happening in the apiary, understanding how the weather forecast plays a part, and most importantly, knowing your bees and what they're capable of. It's not an easy thing to describe really, and actually over the years I've got it wrong time and time again, but learnt from each failure, and every single colony is different, so you do need to judge each and every colony as you go through your apiary. I'll try to explain using an example. Firstly, what factors are going to influence my decision with this step? This isn't a definitive list, it's just some of the decision-making factors that come to mind as I record this podcast. Firstly, the colony. What size are they? How quickly are they expanding their brood nest area? What is the population like in terms of foraging force and nurse bees around that brood nest area? How large is the brood nest? How much space do they have? Is the brood nest area being filled with fresh nectar and pollen, restricting the area that the queen can lay? How many eggs are being laid? I mean, those are just an example of the questions I ask myself as I'm going through the colony. I'm sure there are a lot of other questions too that flash through my mind, and you probably can think of some yourselves. But it's just questions that I ask myself as I'm looking through the colony, and actually a lot of these questions are answered in a blink of an eye, so it doesn't take a lot of time to make that assessment. Obviously, for beginners, these questions take a little longer to answer as you struggle with all of the other questions that distract you with your first inspections. The obvious one being, is that the queen? Stick with it, and it does get easier, I promise. So my assessment here is targeting growth within the colony. For many colonies of an average size or smaller, The whole process can take just a couple of seconds, and I know I can wait another week or two before thinking again about how much space they have. It's the larger growing colonies that need our focus early in the season. For instance, just this week I recorded a video for our Patreon subscribers demonstrating a spring clean and an initial inspection, and I happened to choose one of the larger colonies in the apiary purely by chance. When I removed the roof and integrated feeder, it was obvious this was a strong colony. Pretty much every seam between the bars and every top bar was filled with adult bees moving around them. As I went through the process of swapping the frames from the dirty overwintered hive into the freshly cleaned new season honeypore hive, it was obvious that space was at a premium. Lots of fresh nectar and pollen was coming into the hive and being stored in empty cells around the brood nest area, which had lots of eggs and young larvae, and it was expanding outwards into other frames. The outer frames were fairly well stocked with food stores, and this colony hadn't been fed any additional fondant over the winter period, so they had managed their food stores really well. Now at this point in the inspection, I'm thinking this colony is in need of additional space for the queen to continue to lay eggs and for the brood nest to grow uninterrupted, and they're going to need it fairly quickly. So while I've been doing all of the other tasks, namely the hive swap for the spring cleaning and generally checking the condition of the colony, I've been doing this continual assessment of the colony. Here we switch focus. In my mind, I'm thinking that this colony is ready for expansion. But how will the environment impact this colony's growth moving forward? Namely, what's the weather going to do, and what food will these bees have access to? Well, I've already mentioned the forecast. The weather is currently set warm and dry for the next couple of weeks, so our bees will be able to get out and forage. Again, as I've already mentioned, at our Fishing Lakes apiary, where these bees are located, we have a wealth of forage for them with the goat willow flowering, and this will continue as later goat willow trees flower and provide some successional feeding for them. Again, this really doesn't take very much time at all to assess. A quick look at the forecast on my phone app and a wander around the local area, checking on the trees and plants that are flowering, gives me all the information I need, and with it a little bit of exercise. As luck would have it, we had a spare brood box and drawn frames with comb in them. Now, before you all start thinking I'm somehow blessed to have extra drawn frames of comb, these frames come from colonies that died out over the winter months and are rescued outer frames that contained either stores or were empty-ish. And to be honest, I'd much rather still have those colonies alive than be using these frames. I don't keep any frames that contained dead bees or brood or mouldy frames, or anything that the bees are unlikely to be able to reuse. Those are removed, cut out, the wax rendered down, strained, and the frames boiled and cleaned and reused. That is, unless they're really old and need to go onto the bonfire. So this colony is the first of this new season to be given a second brood box to grow into, and that will hopefully ease any congestion that happens as brood emerges, as adult workers, and more food gets stored for later use. Of course, it's vital, as I keep saying, to assess your local conditions and only make these changes when it's appropriate. Don't think that because I'm doing this, it must be okay for you to do it at the same time. In fact, if it's warmer where you are, you might have already carried out this very process. Elsewhere in this apiary, I discovered a drone-laying queen colony and several below average size colonies. So I'm not bragging about how perfect my beekeeping has been this winter, far from it. The good news is that every colony has now had a spring clean swap, so they're all in nicely cleaned honeypore hives ready for the new season. It makes it a lot easier for me to inspect them with no propolis or wax along the runners in that brood box to get in the way and make a sticky mess. All of the fondant has been removed from every colony now, even the nukes, as the abundance of natural food means our bees are not interested in the slightest with that fondant. And again, for the next fortnight, with the weather set fair, they're not going to need anything at all. Again though, a word of caution. If the weather looks set to change and turn cold, maybe wet, rainy, the fondant will need to go back on quite quickly. Otherwise, larger colonies can starve in a very short space of time, and smaller colonies can become isolated from their food. In some instances, it would be worth leaving the fondant on, where smaller colonies are still feeding on it. So I hope my example has given you some help in how to make a common sense assessment of where your colonies are in terms of space and food at this critical time of the year. Do get in touch if you have any questions about spring cleaning or anything else that you've heard in today's podcast. In other news, we've been having a clean out at the workshop. Lots of old boxes that should have been moved on have gone. Old frames have had the wax removed and rendered, and actually, now that the honeypore hives have been taken out to use for the spring clean, it's actually opened up a lot of space for me. We have a few more Technoset hives to scrape clean, and then those will be stored or sold, and frames are getting bundled, ready to go into the barrel for boiling clean. As I mentioned earlier, some very old frames are heading to the bonfire as we continue to renew and replace brood frames. I also have several hundred super frames that need to be boiled, so we'll be getting on with that over the next fortnight too. Finally, 2 quick comments to finish the day. Our heather honey has suddenly started selling for some strange reason. It's been sat in buckets for, too long really, but just recently we've seen a significant increase in stock going out to the stores that we sell it through. Now, I'm obviously really happy about that, but have no idea why it's happened. So it does look like we'll be heading back to North Yorkshire later this year to give it another try. Next weekend sees the British Beekeepers Association Spring Convention once more, and I'll be there presenting my seminar about our use of section squares and Ross rounds to a select group of pre-booked beekeepers. And following on from that, I'll be talking about making the most of the swarming period later on Saturday afternoon. So do come along and say hello if you happen to be there. With that in mind, the podcast will be delayed for a week, as I'll be away all weekend at the Harper Adams Agricultural University. Maybe I'll take my voice recorder and get something of interest down for the podcast while I'm there. Well, that's it for this week. Don't forget to check out my website, www.norfolk-honey.co.uk, and for my latest videos and podcasts with more updates, tips and techniques, it's the same Patreon page, www.patreon.com/Norfolk Honey. And remember, I'm Stewart Spinks, and that was Beekeeping, short and sweet.